So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second session of our fall seminar on Russian literature. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Good, lovely. And it is my very great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker for the day, Professor Anne Lounsbery, who was kind enough to agree upon giving a talk at our seminar this fall. Anne, as you may know, is professor of Russian and Slavic Studies at New York University. She got a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard, and she specializes in 19th century Russian prose, the rise of print culture, theories of the novel, Russian literature in comparative perspective, and imaginary geographies. Anne is the author of two books. The first book was entitled Think Culture, High Heart, Gogol, Author and Authorship in 19th Century Russia and America, and it was published by Harvard University Press in 2005. And her second book was entitled Life is Elsewhere, Symbolic Geography in the Russian Provinces, and it was published by Cornell University Press in 2019. And also authored multiple papers on Pushkin's Blackness, Dostoevsky's Geography, Economics in Oblomov, Serfdom in Tolstoy, and the concept of mirovая литература. The title of a talk today is Herzen's Petits Bourgeois on the origins of stigmatizing meshchanstvo in Russian culture. So, Anne, the floor is yours. Thanks again for joining the seminar. You have a generous 45 minutes. You can use more if you want, and then we'll have a Q&A for about an hour.
Thank you so much, Rodolphe, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to everybody for coming to listen. I really appreciate it very much, and I won't take more than 45 minutes of your time. And actually, what I was hoping to do, and maybe Rodolphe or someone here who's tech savvy can help me do that, I was hoping to put a word copy of my talk into the chat, because I know that for me, it's not always easy to listen to papers in Russian or in French and concentrate. So, Rodolphe, I am putting this on you because I just emailed you a copy of the presentation. If you can figure out how to put it in the chat, that would be great. If not, I will do my best to hold your attention. But I know it takes a lot out of my brain to listen to presentations that are not in my native language. So thank you very much. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, that's my first real victory, that I was able to share my screen. So I want to start, my title, as Rodolphe said, is Herzen and the Petits Bourgeois on the origins of stigmatizing meshchanstvo in Russian culture. And I want to start with a few words about how I became interested in this somewhat strange topic, and why I do occasionally feel a somewhat perverse desire to defend such a stigmatized category as the petit bourgeois, or in Russian, things meshchansky. And there's this wonderful, oh wait, maybe you're not seeing, hang on, maybe you can't see the whole, sorry, trying to figure this out.
No, we can actually.
You can see the
Yeah,
whole
it's fine.
Oh, okay, good. You can see the whole thing. Okay.
Do you want to try to switch from one slide to the other so that we
Sure.
can make sure
But I
that
wanted to just give you time to look at that wonderful Aileen Kelly quote. There's no feature of European life that a Russian armed with the correct historical insight cannot interpret as a sign of decay, not even the crisp white cloth adorning the table in the impeccably clean waiting room at the first German coach station across the border. And now I'm going to go to the second slide. So first of all, one reason I got interested in this is that I think meshchanstvo is one of the great Russian untranslatables. What is a meshchanin? Is a meshchanin a petit bourgeois, a Philistine, a burgher, a German Spitzbürger? Even when we're not trying to translate it, the term meshchanstvo is slippery, as slippery, I think, as Nabokov's notorious Poshtlist. Meshchansky, in fact, covers part of the same semantic ground as Poshli, as well as overlapping with words like obyvatelski and mелкобуржуазный. So part of why I got interested in the category is just because it's hard to pin down. But my fascination also stems from my own attraction to forms and tastes and social milieus that could be described as partaking of the meshchanski. I'm particularly sympathetic to meshchanstvo when it seems to be pushing back against the imperious claims of various modernist minimalisms. I recall with affection, for example, the kinds of Soviet and post-Soviet apartments that the emigre writer Francine Duplessis-Gray lovingly described. Gray writes about overstuffed interiors with, quote, chintz-covered armchairs, ubiquitous textiles, surfaces embellished with ornaments, unquote. And all these were forms of decor that in certain periods violated official aesthetic norms. In the words of historian Susan Reed, such interiors aim to, quote, resist the intrusions of the public sphere and the cold drafts of change. And indeed, the uyut, the coziness of meshchanstvo, is associated with a problematic withdrawal from public-mindedness, as I will discuss. Nonetheless, I'm drawn to the small worlds that meshchansky uyut aims to create, and I often find myself defending the rights of small people to be small, to not be roped into some big guys, big plans. So this slide is just some vocabulary that you're probably familiar with, as well as a shot from a Soviet production of Gorky's play Meshchanya. The associations evoked by the words meshchanstvo and its cognates are familiar. For one thing, it calls up closed spaces, defended from the outside world, intent on self-preservation. It's that meshchanskaya poshlost that's so reviled by the turn of the 20th century in texts by Chekhov, Mayakovsky, Gorky, and many others. And there are a few in the slides here. I'm not going to read them all. Chekhov, of course, refers often to the meshchanskaya kitchen-ish, gray side of life. Mayakovsky famously rejects cozy rooms and pet canaries. Gorky's meshchanin, and I do love this quote, is, quote, a pudgy little man with a belly, a lover of oysters, women, a nice poem, a cigar. In the decades around 1900, meshchanstvo is often likened to a stagnant swamp, bolota, tina, or balota, sorry, tina. In Gorky's words, it's a huge, boggy mire. In meshchanstvo's overlap with the semantic field of words like byt and obyvatelstvo, we often register a connection to a degraded version of domestic life. Meshchanstvo evokes the material side of living, that which is emphatically not spiritual, not abstract. In Gorky's notes to his play Meshchanya, and I'll go back to this image, he specifies that the stage should be crowded with huge, heavy furniture, houseplants, and knickknacks. And when he claims, and this is here, that meshchanstvo, quote, acts like a microbe causing shameful maladies, that's the second to last quote here, we sense meshchanstvo's tendency to spread infection. And this is the same association we see in early Soviet campaigns against what they call domestic trash. Let me just stop for a minute and ask, was it possible to put the paper in the chat? Was it able to go there?
I have just CC'd it to Dasha, and I think that she just did it. Let me check the chat.
That just as long as there's been an attempt.
Here it is. Yep.
Okay. So anyone who wants to consult, it should be pretty much the same as what I'm saying.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. The impulse to demonize things meshchansky and petit bourgeois is a tendency we see over and over, not just in Soviet campaigns, but in various reformers, modernizers, and revolutionaries all over the place. This makes sense once we consider that the private space of home can threaten forces that aim to connect everyone and everything to some larger project. Domestic life can resist assimilation to what is public and capital H historical. Hence, various big thinkers' unrelenting hostility to the petit bourgeois householders whose priorities are not aligned with their grand plans. And this is a point that's made very powerfully by the brilliant anarchist historian James C. Scott, who's influenced a lot the way that I think about these things. As I'll explain, before the Russian word meshchanstvo took on the figurative meanings that we know today, it was just a legal designation referring to a certain social group. But why was it meshchanstvo that took on negative connotations rather than, say, kupeczeństwo? What made this new usage compelling? What's the difference between meshchanstvo and poshlost? In what ways do the connotations of meshchania, Meshchansky people, overlap with and differ from those of the French petits bourgeois? So ultimately, I want to approach these questions today through the writings of Herzen, because Herzen, I think, represents a key moment in the process whereby meshchanstvo came to represent not only a certain class, but also a set of judgments, ranging from the moral and aesthetic to the ideological and hygienic. And here I want to shout out to one person who's in the audience, who's Olga Mayorova, who first suggested that I look at Herzen when I'm trying to figure out these origins. But I should also be clear that my project is not really about Herzen. That is, my goal is not an exhaustive analysis of how he saw the relationship between family life and history, which is, of course, a major theme in my past and thoughts. And it's not to trace the evolution of his views, which others can do better than I can. Rather, I want to explore a loose set of ideas that I think Herzen's writings helped transmit to later periods, ideas that have come down to us. Before I turn to Herzen, I want to go back briefly to the period of Catherine's reign, and that is to outline how meshchanstvo came into being as an official legal category, not yet as a slur. It was under Catherine that officials invented the category meshchanstvo, and they did so because the state was worried that Russia's lack of a European-style estate or middle sort of people was impeding economic development. The meshchanstvo category was supposed to be a corrective to this problem. Until 1775, people ascribed to this legal category were called posadzki or kupci. After 1775, they were called meshchania, though still occasionally posadzki. The meshchanstvo was intended to be a lower subdivision of the urban population. That is, it was supposed to be right below the three guilds of the kupeczeństwo. In legal terms, this sort of subsoslovia, the meshchania, they had certain clear rights as well as tax and service obligations, and that was the same as members of other legal categories. But when the term started to be used in a sociological rather than a strictly legal sense, neither its boundaries nor its makeup were clear. By the 19th century, the meshchania became the largest and most amorphous section of the urban community. In 1912, Nikolai Rubachin, in his statistical study Россия в цифрах, described the meshchania as the forgotten soslovia. Even today, the group remains under-researched and poorly understood. And that's especially surprising given the fact that it was actually a huge number of people. So what this tells us is that the state, having imagined the meshchanstvo into being, had a difficult time getting a handle on it. And here I'm drawing on the work of the historian Elise Firstschafter. This difficulty was due partly to the fact that officials themselves, state officials, tended to employ the category meshchanstvo as a repository for anybody that they couldn't categorize. All unattached individuals, retired soldiers, vagrants, orphans, foundlings, anybody of illegitimate birth. The result was that the category's social meaning was fundamentally ambiguous and unstable, characterized by porous boundaries, indeterminate definitions, and flexible structures. And I think this description, which is Firstschafter's, comports again with James Scott's characterization of the petty bourgeoisie. They are, he says, neither fish nor fowl, ni ryba ni мясо. Let me go here. So what about the kupeczeństwo? How did they figure in? Well, there was always slippage between kupeczeństwo and meshchanstvo because the meshchanstvo was where failed merchants ended up. But so did most other people who slipped through cracks between soslovia. The distinction, the real life distinction between the status of kupets and meshchanin was of huge significance. For instance, meshchania were grouped with peasants in the podatne soslovia, literally the taxable estates. But beyond just being obligated to pay certain taxes, these groups were also subject to the draft and to corporal punishment, and their mobility was limited. So meshchania, but not kupci, are part of these taxable estates. They formed part of a fundamentally dependent and often precarious category of people. And I'd say that today's American analogy would quite clearly be gig workers, no health insurance, right? Such was not the case for the kupci. So it's not surprising that the kupieczeństwa really did cling to patriarchal tradition and submit to state power much more than did the meshchanstvo. The kupci had a serious stake in preserving the status quo. In the social imaginary, the distinctions between kupieczeństwa and meshchanstvo were sharp. The idea of the kupiec calls up solidity, the meshchanin, fragmentation, pettiness. Both in the collective imagination and in real life, one might characterize the kupieczeństwa as closed, stable, static, traditional, and thus symbolically pure. The meshchanstvo, by contrast, was porous, dependent, unstable, and impure. Merchants could draw on the symbolic value of this purity. So, for example, the vastly wealthy art collector Pavel Tretyakov, there he is in the middle, he deliberately dressed to highlight his roots in the Moscow kupieczeństwa, patriarchal beard, old-fashioned long coat, high-topped, square-toed boots. So from this, we can surmise that for Tretyakov, conforming to a clear image of the archetypal kupiec afforded him some protection against those who might claim superiority over him by virtue of their higher social origins. Whereas looking like an archetypal meshchanin, if you could even imagine such a thing, would have carried no benefit. And even calling up the visual image of a meshchanin would have been much harder than calling up the visual image of a kupiec. So if you think, for example, of the very robust tradition of, let's see, I've lost my place, of merchant portraiture that goes back to the 18th century, there's no meshchania parallel for that. And I'm gonna leave us here for a minute because I love my kupcichy, and you can see how solid they are. These differences help explain why over time it was the meshchanin rather than the kupiec who came to be associated with certain defects that are in other traditions associated with the petit bourgeois. And here are those deficits. The meshchanstvo's combination of instability and impurity, I suspect, is what made it attractive for appropriation and symbolic extension, even before the great reforms effectively stripped the category of legal force. Just to be clear, despite how the Russian terms are often rendered in English, neither kupieczeństwo nor meshchanstvo was any sort of bourgeoisie in the European sense of the word. Rather, both were part of what the historian Alfred Reber called the vast splintered middle of Russian society. Now, in the years around the Great Reforms, other occupants of this middle space included the raznachinci, and plenty of raznachinci had their soslovia origins in the meshchanstvo. The term raznachinets, unlike meshchanin, is not an official legal designation. It's just a way of labeling people who fell outside of the usual categories for whatever reasons. In reality, a raznachinets, taken to mean a person of non-noble origins who had attained to some education, a raznachinets might end up being either a conservative-minded small proprietor, a meshchanin, or a radical intelligent. In the middle decades of the century, raznachinci and meshchania were not yet clearly distinguished from each other in people's minds. In fact, sometimes the words were used almost interchangeably. as we'll see, for example, in Nikolai Pomilovsky's two novellas from 1861, which use both of these words in ways that are almost the same. So for a while, meshchanie and raznachinцы could be seen as kind of interchangeable. But by the last decades of the century, the symbolic opposition between meshchanie and raznachinцы had solidified. Meshchanie came to be seen as conservative, while raznachinцы were coded as radical, and thus as being symbolically aligned with the intelligentsia. Each group, meshchanie and raznachinцы, came to be associated with a particular aesthetic, a set of tastes and distastes that pitted it against the other. This was the period when members of the intelligentsia were defining themselves explicitly in opposition to meshchanstvo. In Svetlana Boym's words, the intelligentsia used the fight against meshchanstvo to construct their own identity. And as a result, meshchanstvo and intelligentsia became mutually constitutive. You really couldn't have one without the other. Also in this period, later 19th century, the term meshchanstvo was sometimes deployed just as an insult, a term of abuse, in the same way as poshlost. But I would argue that there's a distinction. I think that meshchanstvo was distinct from poshlost and is still, in that meshchanstvo is linked to a lowly and kind of grubby, dirty version of materiality. So if we wanted to sum up the difference between poshlost and meshchanstvo, we might say, if poshlost is a bad poem and a lace doily, then meshchanstvo is just the lace doily, and that lace doily is covered with flies. In the social imaginary, meshchanstvo was much more strongly associated with the physical facts of byt in a bad way, and the domestic sphere. Now, kupci too, because they were inhabitants of this world that was centered on home and counting house, they were also associated with a version of materiality, as we see in these portraits. But again, in symbolic terms, I think the merchantry's world was solid, unified, predictable, and saturated with traditional meanings, whether positive or negative. And that served to connect merchants to coherent, larger patterns. By contrast, the meshchanie eventually came to be marked as chaotic and suspiciously impure, including ethnically, as I'll discuss later. The meshchanie have circumscribed lives that locate them in the mire, the swamp of the strictly local. Like obyvateli, they are what Americans call townies. And in fact, the word meshchanstvo derives from Polish miasto, which means town. And this word, along with meshchanie, signals lowness, stasis, non-transcendence. So meshchanie are thought to be constituted by their lowly environment and its many constraints. And here, and this looks ahead to Herzen a little bit, there can be no overlap between the experience of a meshchanin and what Bourdieu calls the pure gaze. That is the pure gaze you need for experiencing art, a gaze that depends on objective distance from necessity and from those trapped within necessity. According to most 19th century aesthetic ideologies, meshchanie don't have what it takes to make or appreciate art. In that sense, like colonial subjects, the poor, slaves, and women, they're doomed to the opposite of detachment and transcendence. So now I'm going to turn to Herzen, and I'll assume most of you know the basics of his life. His writings of roughly the 1840s through the 1860s were highly influential in Russian, and at the same time as this category of meshchanstvo was kind of taking on significance. So looking at his work, we can see, I hope, first of all, how the terms meshchanstvo and petit bourgeois became entangled. And second, how both came to be associated with a middling version of culture, which for Herzen represented the worst of Europe and the worst of modernity itself. my suspicion is, and here's where Olga Mayorova helped me, my suspicion is that in Herzen, we are seeing a key moment in meshchanstvo's symbolic transformation, a moment that points forward to Gorky's, Mayakovsky's, and others' fulminations against it. If we actually look at Herzen's texts, his use of the term meshchanstvo and its cognates, it is not consistent. And I should make clear that I'm not trying to trace the evolution of his usage. I think that's something that the editors of his new Собрание сочинения could do better than I could, and it's not something that I've tried very, very diligently to do. I'm more just looking at the range of ways he uses the term. In the letters from France and Italy, which date from 1847 to 1852, he sometimes deploys meshchanstvo to describe a very specific social stratum. That is, he uses it to mean the French petite bourgeoisie, by which he means, in a very straightforward socioeconomic sense, that social layer between the bourgeoisie and the narod, the common people. So, for example, at one point he writes, quote, on the margin between the worker, that is the proletarian, and the bourgeoisie, he writes, is the poor meshchanstvo. And some members of the meshchanstvo earn Herzen's approval because he claims they identify with the narod and they preserve its revolutionary traditions. But others, he says, set themselves apart from the common people and aspire to bourgeois status, which is bad. Elsewhere in the letters, though, Herzen uses meshchanstvo more loosely, not to mean a particular socioeconomic stratum. Sometimes he starts equating meshchanstvo and bourgeoisie, and he sets both of them against the narod. And I have a few examples, but I won't list them all here. And if anybody's interested, I can send some of the citations. In the essays that Herzen published in the early 1860s, under the title Ends and Beginnings, Konce и начала, things look a little bit different. Here, the word bourgeoisie, the French word bourgeoisie, virtually never appears, but forms of meshchanstvo are everywhere. And the reason for that is because meshchanstvo has become shorthand for everything Herzen thinks is despicable about European societies, which he thinks are structured entirely by self-interest. That, for him, explains their leveling effect on human individuality, their destruction of creativity, their love of order for the sake of order. We see something similar around the same time in his foreword to the new 1858 edition of the letters. Here, meshchanstvo is thoroughly divorced from social fact, and it's used just to indicate a set of negative qualities. And chief among these negative qualities is what Herzen sees as mediocrity, посредственность. In his 1859 review of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, the word посредственность recurs over and over, every time representing the antithesis of everything Herzen stands for. And now I'm going to move on to some other Herzen quotes where he's really getting into the meshchanstvo thing. In Ends and Beginnings, and this is the first quote here, in a line referring to Griboyedov's scheming secretary Malchalin in the play Woe from Wit, Herzen says that the meshchanstvo, like Malchalin, has two talents, moderation and exactitude, умеренность и аккуратность. For Herzen, moderation and exactitude are the defining and confining characteristics of middling lives. And what I would emphasize is that Herzen, as a good aristocratic revolutionary, Herzen hates middles. To a man of his tastes, the middle's virtues and its shortcomings are equally petty, as he says again in this first quote. The life of the middling order is full of minor faults and minor virtues. So Herzen mourns the loss of good old-fashioned aristocrats. And here I'm referring to slide 2, what he calls their knightly valor, the elegance of their aristocratic mores which have been supplanted, he thinks, by the Meshchanskia virtues of sobriety and pragmatism. quote, nightly honor, chest, has been replaced by a bookkeeper's version of honesty, честностью. And parks are replaced in this new world. Parks are replaced by vegetable gardens. And here parks parki calls up the nobility's grand estates, and vegetable gardens, again, tying meshchanstvo to a life more circumscribed by domesticity. For Herzen, middling pettiness is reflected above all in what he sees as the meshchanstvo's stinginess, both economic and spiritual. And again, I'm looking at the first quote. The life of the middling orders is restrained, often stingy. It flees whatever is excessive or extreme. Herzen's meshchanin is devoted to his own property and his own comfort. And this is slide 3. Or not slide 3, quote 3. Meshchanstvo is the chicken in every pot that Henry IV dreamed of. A small house with little shutters looking out to the streets, schooling for his son, a dress for his daughters, a worker for the heavy tasks. Yes, this is truly a haven of salvation, havre de grâce. This is the petit bourgeois well-being, meshchanskoye благосостояние, that Herzen foresees for all of Europe. That is an entirely banal domestic prosperity focused on the practical and the concrete. In a meshchanin's home, he thinks, the virtues of both peasantry and nobility, and for Herzen, these castes are symbolically aligned, as they are for Tolstoy, these virtues are crowded out. The nobleman's garden, with its possibilities of disinterested pleasure and even grandeur, the nobleman's garden again turns into the kitchen garden. The thatched peasant hut turns into a small town house with painted shields on the shutters where they nonetheless drink tea and eat meat every day. So a cozy little house with painted shutters, a nice cup of tea. What could be worse, right? Recounting his own search for an apartment in Paris, Herzen expresses distaste for the typical cozy, уютно, and deathly monotonous, unquote, domestic arrangements he's shown before finding an old-fashioned and austere place for himself, one that suggests to him a different understanding of what constitutes the comforts of life, a real chez soi. For Herzen, the traits that link meshchanstvo to middle-class domesticity, prudence, calculation. Let's see, I never gave you slide 10. I'm sorry. Oh, no, I did here. This is the first quote on this slide. For Herzen, the traits that link meshchanstvo to middle-class domesticity, prudence, calculation, self-satisfaction, physical well-being, these traits are also what make it incompatible with art. And this goes back to the Bourdieu quote that I was talking about before. Excuse me. Herzen writes, sorry, art is not at ease in the prim, too tidy, calculating home of the meshchanin. It senses that it has been reduced to the function of external decoration, wallpaper, furniture. And wallpaper, I'm noticing, is always bad when people are talking about how meshchanstvo is bad. The meshchanin's world is so confining that it reduces art to vulgarity. And I'm returning to the quote, art cannot bear the measuring stick. A life that is complacent in its limited mediocrity is stained in art's eyes by the most terrible stain in the world, vulgarity. And now I'm looking at quote 5. Herzen says that the artist can work with the highest elements and with the lowest, that is, with the Madonna or with a peasant in rags, but he will, quote, stop in despair before the meshchanin in a dress coat. And here, I think it's worth noting that we could not be further from Flaubert's injunction to vivre en bourgeois et penser en demi-dieu. Herzen is not interested in how petit bourgeois domestic life in the hands of a genius might be transformed into Madame Bovary. What Herzen is rejecting is akin to the happy ending home life that we associate with a Dickens novel. For Dickens, a retreat to the suburbs, a movement away from historical forces and toward a more strictly private life, Such a retreat sometimes holds out real hope of contentment and safety. At least for Dickens, this hope appears to be real sometimes. For Herzen, such a domestic ending would be, it seems, too mired in the trivial concerns of the mещанин. When Herzen repudiates what he calls mещанское благосостояние, the kitchen garden, the cup of tea, the chicken in every pot, he does so not so much because he believes mещане are greedy, although he does believe that. More significantly, it's because he sees in them a contemptible desire to exist only for themselves, renouncing connection with and responsibility for any larger social whole. In Herzen's view, historical and cultural stagnation is the mещанство's preferred medium. Mещане embrace stasis, and this stasis allows not just for safety, but for accumulation. And let's see, we start to see hints of this in this quote number 7 from My Past and Thoughts. This is another way that Herzen, I think, foretells the image of mещанство that will be consolidated later, that is, its persistent association with this thickly material version of culture. And this is the association that will eventually allow the intelligentsia to see itself as so nobly abstract. According to this image, the mещаnin's life is a strictly physical one, unredeemed by any higher meaning. The Bolsheviks will say consciousness, a life we might characterize as a negative version of Flemish genre painting, grotesquely excessive meals, and smug, dirty rooms. Luckily, though, according to Herzen, Russians are not at risk of descending into mещанство. And here I'm looking at slide at quote number 8. In this passage, where he's dismissing his countrymen who cautioned against moving too quickly towards socialism, Herzen declares, quote, we, meaning we Russians, are not lawyers, we are not mещане, unquote. Mещанство, he declares, is radically opposed to Russianness. And in his insistence on mещанство's non-Russian character, which others will pick up on and develop later, we develop hints of an unwholesomely foreign taint that will attach to the category in later decades and writers. I think such claims raise the possibility that if Russians are not mещане, then maybe mещане are not quite Russians. Witness how in certain later 19th and early 20th century texts, traits associated with mещанство, and here I'm quoting Laurie Manchester, traits like uncultured behavior, excessive attachment to material objects, coarseness, self-interest, these were also commonly associated with Jews, Tatars, and Armenians, people who were, not coincidentally, employed mainly in commerce and classed as mещане. And this is why I want to argue that mещанство unites in one stigmatized category multiple forms of taint that had long been regarded with suspicion in many sectors of imperial Russian society. Non-Russianness in general, Jewishness in particular, mercantile individualism, and the various impure boundary-crossing practices of trade. And it's interesting that this implication of foreignness distinguishes Russian mещанство from its contemporary equivalents in other traditions. So Flaubert's petits bourgeois, for example, are contemptible, but they are unequivocally French. If anything, they're maybe too French. The German Spießbürger, too, is utterly German. The mещанин, however, might not always be purely Russian. And in the same passage where Herzen remarks on mещанство's incompatibility with the Russian character, this is quote 8, he explains why Russians have no need for the, quote, crotchety abstemiousness of older nations. We are simpler than that, he says. We are healthy. We are unsuited to a fastidious hospital regimen. And I did have a hard time translating this, but unburdened by housewifely prudence and moral hygiene, why should Russians submit to a diet prescribed for scrawny old men? The sentiments here are familiar. That is, Europe is old and declining. Russia is young and ascending. But the vocabulary, hygiene and taint, health and non-health, this vocabulary is worth noticing, not least because once more it foreshadows later discourses surrounding meshchanstvo. Especially in the early Soviet period, meshchanstvo was often represented in hygienic terms as a disease calling for eradication. Bukharin, speaking in 1921, warns of the meshchanske infection threatening the working classes. And Gorky, as we saw here, Gorky says much the same in 1934, in the last quote in this slide, raising the alarm that meshchanstvo lurks everywhere like a microbe, causing shameful maladies. Okay, so now I'm going to turn away from Herzen and to his contemporary, a lesser-known writer named Pomilovsky. Nikolai Pomilovsky, 1835 to 1863. And the reason I'm turning away from Herzen to Pomilovsky is just to think about the possibility that at mid-century, mid-19th century in Russia and in the Russian language, there were possibilities inherent in the word meshchanstvo, meshchanie, meshchanske счастье, that were not developed. I mean, Herzen's view is, I think, the view that ended up dominating, but there were other possibilities maybe inherent in the term, and these are long lost today. So I want to look at Pomilovsky, a Raznochinets writer whose most important works appeared in the same years when Herzen's texts were reaching Russian readers. Pomilovsky might be described as the paradigmatic Raznochinets writer, and he suffered a paradigmatically tragic Raznochinets fate. Born in 1835 into a clerical family, he received a brutal education at Séminaire, which is the subject of his harrowing memoir, Ocherki Borsy. After Séminaire, he was largely self-educated. He enjoyed early success as a writer, but his career lasted only from 1859 to 1863 because he died of alcoholism at age 28. But had he survived, and with him his view of what a meshchanin's life could mean, it's possible that Russian literature and Russian cultural history might look somewhat different. In 1860 and 1861, Pomilovsky published the novella Meshchanske счастье and its sequel, Molotov. At the center of these texts is the character Molotov. He's a Raznochinets of meshchanstvo origins. Taking us through Molotov's early life, education, and employment in Petersburg, Pomilovsky sets up his hero as a kind of socio-narrative experiment, posing the question, what happens to a person who hails from the meshchanske and meshchanstvo and comes to occupy a fundamentally indeterminate status? What can be done with such a life? What values will such a life foster? And what is striking about the story is that the fate of this meshchanin Raznochinets, this hero, his fate is not tragic. Although young Molotov suffers and is subjected to humiliations, he overcomes obstacles. He manages to educate himself. He makes a decent living as a Petersburg chinovnik, and he marries appropriately. And here in this passage is a description of his wife's family home. They live in a cozy, peaceful, well-appointed apartment, a very appealing place that Pomilovsky describes in detail, lingering on its books, paintings, and plants. It's a domestic scene that's almost exaggeratedly snug. Bright candles, clean linens, warm fire, rustling newspapers, quiet, peaceful conversation and study. They read, sew, and chat. And they do seem to live in perfect stasis, apart and sheltered from the outside world. Quote, their life was a sequestered one. The city's noise and rumble made its way through the double window panes dully, as if from another kingdom. They enjoy a suspended in time placidity. Certainly, this description calls up precisely the kind of meshchanske contentment that Herzen and others deplored. for seeking to locate itself outside of history's movement, for prioritizing material accumulation above all. And in fact, in the novella Molotov, the narrator's final words undercut poor Molotov's meshchanské счастье. And here, let's see, the last words of the novella are "Tutti конец мещанскому счастью, эх, господа, что-то скучно," right? So we get this description of his seemingly pretty good life, and then we're told that it is actually sad. Oh, gentlemen, that is somehow sad. Almost as if it was a verdict pronounced by Herzen himself. So my question is, do we have to agree with the narrator's verdict? And I'll take you back to the long quote in case you want to look at it. Do we have to agree with this narrator's verdict? Typically, Pomilovsky's text is interpreted in light of this judgment. So here I'll read you from a typical assessment, a critic's typical assessment of the text. Quote, "This scene of bourgeois happiness illustrates the true tragedy of the life of an educated Reznochinets like Molotov. The little personal world where he can live, think, work, and be free locks him away from the life of real freedom and active work," unquote. Okay, that's one possible interpretation. But the text as a whole might also be read as mounting a pretty good defense of the idea that there is such a thing as meshchanské счастье, that it is not an illegitimate or contemptible goal. Now, certainly this modest happiness that Molotov achieves, and that's described, I think, in this quote, it's definitely shown to be a product of what Herzen would call the meshchanské virtues, умеренность и аккуратность. In fact, Pomilovsky gives us a very long, very detailed account of how Molotov's wife's family, going back several generations, having started out extremely poor, how they labored, saved, and planned, right? And was all about умеренность и аккуратность. And they go from being extremely poor to having this version of meshchanské счастье. But I don't think it follows that we have to read their happy ending as nothing but a deplorable retreat from some larger life in favor of mere stagnation. Rather, we might interpret this outcome not through Herzen's lens, but through, say, Dickens, for whom such processes of calculation and accumulation are not always stigmatized. And in support of this more sympathetic reading, I point to the way that the text directs our attention to the history of this meshchanské счастье. As I said, Pomilovsky notes and he describes at great length the generations of labor that produced the quiet scene. Having evoked the мирное счастье, as he says, the peaceful happiness of what might be taken to be an ahistorical life, he goes on to historicize it. Pomilovsky writes elsewhere, "This life did not," or maybe it's in this quote, maybe not, "this life did not take shape immediately. 100 years, a whole century had to pass in the creation of this peaceful family group that we see in a bright, cozy room at a round table." The century-long backstory of what built the family's comfortable byt centers on long, hard, slow labor under very specific historical circumstances, and it features canniness and calculation. I think Pomilovsky gives a fairly sympathetic incarnation to the умеренность и аккуратность that fill Herzen, the aristocratic revolutionary, with revulsion. This might be a too contrarian reading of Pomilovsky, given that it does go against his narrator's seemingly explicit instruction in that last sentence for interpreting the protagonist's fate. But I think that the usual interpretation of Molotov is so limiting that it forecloses possibilities that may well be present in Pomilovsky's text, and perhaps in others' texts as well. To condemn Molotov's version of happiness, meshchanské счастье, is to see it through other and especially later condemnations of meshchanstvo, with all their well-known contempt for what is small. So my goal is not to make Molotov into the kind of English novel in which true happiness might be described as the earned estrangement from historical forces. Rather, it's to reconsider some of our judgments, often inherited from thinkers like Herzen, about the potential value of what has been deemed inconsequential. And here I'm going to quote James Scott again. Scott writes, he describes how when the French word petit is translated into English as petty, it comes to mean not just small, but also contemptibly trivial, as in pettifoggery, petty cash, just plain petty. When it is compounded into petty bourgeoisie, it joins the contempt of Marxists, the intelligentsia, and their aristocracy for the Philistine tastes and crass concern for money and property of the nouveau arrivé. The contempt that Scott describes is useful for thinking about exactly why and how meshchanstvo has been stigmatized. For one thing, as Scott notes, regardless of ideology, states tend to dislike the petty bourgeoisie because their small property can elude its control. And for another, as I suggested earlier, meshchanstvo is among those forces that can, I think, undermine ideologies that aim to connect and subject everything to some larger project or bigger time. And that's whether that bigger time is Vera Pavlovna's fourth dream in What is to be Done, or Lenin's communist utopia, or today's tech bros singularity. From the perspective of reformers on high, meshchanstvo's aim is simply to protect itself from encroachments, and that includes the encroachments of historical change. And this is why Gorky indicts meshchanstvo for retarding social progress. He calls the meshchanya a gray, sticky layer that has thickly covered over the common people. The common people, of course, are the real agents of change. Meshchanya, Gorky says, prefer a peaceful life in the rear of the strongest army. They want to live, quote, live tranquilly and nicely, not taking part in the battle. That is, the battle that is Gorky's definition of history. And I think that here in Gorky's indictments of meshchansky status, we hear echoes of Herzen, despite the fact that Herzen, to be clear, did not share Gorky's belief in teleological or progressive history. So now I'm going to sum up, and it might be a little impressionistic because I want to look ahead to some ideas that I hope to explore in my larger project. Meshchanya and petit bourgeois are symbolically marked by their transcendent and by their sequestered and untranscendent localness, especially, I think, in their material culture, which is of particular interest to me. And this probably isn't the greatest picture to represent Soviet-era meshchanstvo, but it's the best I have found so far. Their material culture is especially interesting to me. Meshchanya represent the very opposite of the frictionless, assimilable mobility that's prized by modernizers of various times and places, because the mottliness of meshchanstvo can disrupt imposed from above uniformity. So consider, for instance, the Soviet campaigns, especially in the 20s and the 60s, aimed at purging daily life of the clutter and pointless ornament that aesthetic authorities deemed meshchansky. They tried to persuade ordinary people to modernize and streamline their homes, but often their advice was rejected